They're gonna catch me checklist. That's a bad bet.
Welcome back to Never Fade, the NFT podcast. I'm your host, FaXx, and we're coming off a very interesting weekend. It was Super Bowl Sunday, and it was also Super Burn Sunday, which, if you're not aware, was a huge event in the NFT space involving Jack Butcher's visualized value checks. And we saw a lot of action, a lot of burning, a lot of minting, and a lot of price action too. Good Month is not going to be joining us. So we're bringing in a special guest today, Mitch Morales. He leads our business development and operations team at Good Month Labs and is also a managing partner of Right Click Save Ventures, which is a crypto and NFT focused product studio and investment fund. So let's bring in Mitch to talk about checks and see where we're at. And we're also going to be joined by the biggest holder of checks in the NFT space, Schmrypto. But first, let's go to Mitch. How are you doing, Mitch?
Yeah, I'm good. I think since the last time we talked, checks hit all-time high in the 2.69 range. We then saw them drop somewhat precipitously as we got closer to the burn event. Yeah, it's really interesting to see. I think the market kind of didn't know what to do. We had a lot of FUD in the wider crypto space circling around, and yeah, I think we've recovered a little bit, but it'll be really interesting and fun to hear from Schmrypto today. As still the biggest holder of originals and editions, how he's feeling and how he's doing on his plan to get down to that black check.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think before we bring him in, we should just do a little bit more background here. I think there's a lot of confusion in the NFT space about, what are editions, what are originals. Like, people are still kind of learning about this. I'm getting a lot of questions. I'm trying to be helpful, answer what I can. But just to take a step back, the original NFT is called editions. So an edition is an unrevealed NFT of the checks. So, comparable to like an unripped pack, if you go all the way back to NBA Top Shot, or to, kind of any unrevealed NFT, it contains what will eventually go on chain as an original. So at the actual burn site, at the mint site, which is burn.checks.art, that's where you can decide if you want to burn your edition. And if you do, it will mint an original. So what will happen to the edition is it'll get burned. So the supply of those editions will go down, and it'll be sent to the burn address, which is essentially like an Ethereum wallet address that nobody has access to, nobody has the keys to, and so it'll kind of live there for perpetuity. So when you burn an edition, you'll mint an original on chain, and that's when you'll learn what your color pattern is, if you have a gradient, the speed of the shift, which is like the animation. So essentially, you're gonna reveal what you got and the rarity of each, and the market will decide really like what they're into. And what it looks like is that the linear Z, which is like a vertical pattern, is the most rare, and it is also kind of like the most high aesthetic. I think a lot of people think there's also angled and a lot of other variations. And what we're seeing is people are having a great time burning those into those originals. And then of course, the next step is going from an 80 check, burning two of them, down to a 40 check, down to a 20 check. And we've already seen all the way down to single checks. And we're having one of those holders of single checks in the studio today. Mitch, you want to add a little bit of color to that and kind of what you saw that Jack and the team and Jaleel and the team did that was different or interesting, that really stood out to you from a, I guess, technologically artistic standpoint?
Yeah, I thought the way that they tried to integrate randomness into the process, and verifiable randomness really was something that Good Month actually called out initially, saying that that's been a problem that people have been trying to solve in different ways um, on ETH for a while now. Like Chainlink obviously has their VRF solution. But yeah, as we get into this kind of open edition, more mature market, and people are trying to play around and gamify more and more of these collections, that's going to be a necessary uh, thing to tackle. In terms of price action, like I think this was probably to be expected. You guys have talked about, the Utes project before, and how those burned Ute tubes are actually trading in a premium to the revealed Utes themselves, and I think this is no different. The opportunity to migrate into a gradient or some other type of really cool color band is an opportunity to essentially get something that's very high value and desired by the market. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, whether additions continue to trade and actually are highly sought after once we get down to fewer and fewer of those on the market. And then once more and more people start burning the originals, people trying to match up combinations. I'm looking for one more gradient. I'm looking for one more color band to make my collection, to hopefully breed these checks down to a single. Yeah, it'll be super interesting to watch.
Yeah, and I have a lot of questions for Schmrypto, just kind of about that process and how to approach selecting originals to burn together. And I think there's a lot of unanswered questions here. And so hopefully we can answer some of those today and bring some of that alpha to our listeners. So without further ado, we're going to bring in Schmrypto, and I'm really excited to hear from him. This is an interesting phenomenon in the NFT space. What's going on here? And this is somebody who's definitely a very active trader and collector. And so looking forward to speaking to him. So let's go ahead and bring him in now. So Schmrypto, thank you so much for joining us here on the Never Fade NFT podcast. Thank you for your time. I think just in general, as like checks holders, as NFT collectors, seeing this phenomenon here and your involvement as the biggest check holder, and essentially just to give you a little background on that, I went to the contract probably like a lot of other people did as the checks were popping off, went to the holders on the token scan and was like, Schmrypto. And who's this right up at the top of this Ether scan? And I dove into your OpenSea a little bit, little wallet watching, my bad, and learned that you've been in the space collecting pretty actively. Love to see it. So Schmrypto, if you don't mind, just kind of give us a little bit of background about yourself. How did we get here, Schmrypto?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on. I've been collecting for just shy of 2 years now. I got into the space late March of 21 and didn't really start getting heavy into it until probably June, just kind of, watching and learning until then. But my first kind of big bag in the space, I guess, was Pixel Vault. That was kind of my introduction to a lot of, kind of what was possible with game theory and mechanics, and what a smart contract could really do in the context of NFTs. And had a pretty big bag of cool cats at one point. Had I think 3 punks at the top, and just been playing the game as best I can. Had an amazing bull run in 21, and then of course 22. Like I think almost everyone, 22 was pretty bad / boring. And so when checks showed up, it was just kind of a breath of fresh air, something different and exciting after this long, slow period. And so I had a few different people direct me to the checks mint, but then two collectors I respect both said that they were going to pull the trigger and buy a bunch of them. And I had followed Jack, but not really collected any of his work prior to that. I liked his work, but I saw my friend had minted 236, so I minted 237 just to be a jerk mostly. So works out well sometimes.
Yeah, that's
Um,
awesome, man.
yeah, and then it was shortly after that that Jack came out with the transparency thread, or transparency time thread as it's called now, this kind of mega thread that was almost like a stream of consciousness diary of his development of checks, which I thought was really fascinating and pretty unprecedented. You know, he kind of redefined building in public, and it's, if you read it, it's, I don't direct people to it so much anymore when they're trying to understand checks, because it has grown into such a like rambling historical document. We kind of need a more succinct uh, rule book for people now, but it's still of tremendous interest if you kind of want to see where checks started and where it ended up, and literally like everything about checks, the way it ends up is outlined in that thread somewhere, and often kind of proposed in that thread and then dialed in based on community feedback, which was cool to see as well.
Yeah, appreciate that. I think before we dive into that, I do want to hear a little bit more about 2022, because like you said, it was rough, man. It was rough. Um, after what happened in 21 with the bull run, and then for things to go so far south in 22, it became very difficult to trade NFTs in general. That was my experience, at least. I mean, like, how did you navigate the bear market, Shrimto?
I honestly just kind of battened down the hatches and waited. You know, I would squeeze out a little liquidity here and there if I saw an artist that I liked or a piece that I just had to have. But I kind of pivoted to just doing uh, kind of talent scout artwork, basically, just trying to go out and find artists who nobody had ever heard of and who I could scoop for nothing, and just kind of made that my 22. You know, I curated my museum a little further and really just focused on artists and art. And then because to my mind the PFP game is really only viable in times of really high volume, uh, and so just been kind of waiting to see the volume come back again. And now that the volume has finally come back, I've kind of lost interest in the PFP game to a degree. Like I'm so down the rabbit hole on checks and Defy, the Creases project, that I'm a bit of a dual maxi now, which is funny. I always said don't be a maxi, but I find myself just wanting to reallocate aggressively into two things and just kind of let everybody have the PFP market, because I don't know. I think what we're seeing being created in both those projects is so transformative in how the space is going to look.
I feel that, I'm a very much like a PFP focused NFT trader. And the reason historically why that's the case is because that's where like a lot of the volume has been, right? It's like, when you do collect, more of the fine art digital pieces, a lot of times those are, longer holds with lower volume, lower activity, and it's a little more straightforward to trade where the highest liquidity is, which of course has been with like the Bored Apes and historically with other PFP projects. But do you just stick to Ethereum NFTs, or have you ventured off of Ethereum at all?
I actually have a pretty sizable Tez wallet. That's about the only place I dabble outside of Ether as an L1. I'm kind of the opinion that once the surge comes, the other L1s are likely in trouble. That a lot of the L1s are basically predicated on high gas prices. And if high gas prices go away, what's their value proposition? I think Tez has carved out a little bit of a separate space for themselves as an incubator for new artists that doesn't necessarily rely on the tokenomics of the underlying token so much. And so I collect art there. I don't think I have any PFPs or anything like that on Tez though, because I do think it's kind of a specific niche that they do well in.
That's interesting. And, actually, we've seen now that DGods has announced a migration off of Solana onto Ethereum, and of course, Utes onto Polygon. So when you think about the Tez art market, as an incubator, do you think that it's potentially natural for maybe an artist that does really well in that market and becomes very recognizable to then move to Ethereum and drop a collection there? Have you seen that yet?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's really Lucrece's story. Lucrece was a major Tez artist early on, and his monsters collection, like if you go back and look, Lucrece's first drops on Ether were going for 1 to 2 Ether. And you go, like, how did that happen? Where did this guy come from? And it's because he built support on Tez first. And so when he came to Ether, he already had a lot of people eager to collect his work there. And so I've seen that's been a really successful transition in that way. Sad Boy, if you're familiar with his work, he started out as a Tez artist who's now doing pretty well on Ether. And you see a little bit of the other direction, but it's kind of funny seeing it the other direction. Like Pop Wonder, for instance, I got a Pop Wonder 1 of 1 on Tez for $900. And, you know, so when Ether artists come to Tez, their stuff doesn't really trade so well, it seems like. But when Tez artists go to Ether, there's this sort of built up demand from the Ether side of it that so like Lucrece's Tez stuff, for instance, trades at like 50 to 60% of what it would trade for on Ether. That's really bizarre. Most artists, their Tez stuff trades for 10 to 20% of what it would trade for on Ether. There's some really crazy deals to be had over there. And at the end of the day too, we're dealing with artists. You know, these are all like person to person interactions. And so I have a hard time imagining that if Tez really does go to zero and the network just implodes, that those artists are just going to be like, well, screw you, should have bought it on Ether. Like I could see a lot of people reminting stuff to Ether if anything ever really goes catastrophically wrong on Tez. So it's a little different than like buying a shit coin on another L1 to me.
Yeah, no, I actually did recently collect some of the monsters pieces, and the main thing I was wondering is how do you say his name? And it sounds like you've got it. So it's Deuce Lecrease. Is that...
No, you know, it's so funny. He says, as far as I know, he just says Dez. Dez Lucre, and he says Lucrece when I talk to him, but it's so I'm in a bad habit of saying Lucrece. He and I kind of came up together. He started producing NFTs a little bit before I started collecting, like a couple months. And then we met very early on when he DM'd me to shill me a Chemical Messiah piece on secondary. And so that made me look at his work, and we kind of stayed in touch since then. And so I chat with him sometimes, and even he pronounces it differently sometimes.
Well, this sounds like alpha. Tez as an incubator to find artists that might interest you, Mitch. I think you hold the Monsters set too, right?
Yeah, on ETH. January was a fun time of some of these projects, at least from my perception, coming up. So when we saw the DeFi set available and kind of teased around what utility that might bring, we snapped one up, and obviously as well as some checks. If I could, I would love to maybe pivot like looking back to kind of like where we are right now and looking forward, Schmrypto. How are you feeling post Super Burn Sunday?
Pretty good. I've been really enjoying seeing the outputs. I think this is a little bit of a case of the NFT market doesn't like to be delivered what they were told they were going to be delivered. That Jack and Jaleel gave everyone exactly what they said they were going to give them. They were transparent from day one all the way through to the drop, and you saw people see the drop and go, and panic sell and go, what the hell are you doing? You know, I'm not worried. I'm sitting on mine. I've got 508 checks. I'm not going anywhere. And like I've said a lot of times, like I'm here for the game. Like I want to play the blackjack game. That's the purpose here. And so price action to me is kind of irrelevant in the short term. I think that the game itself is great. You know, the UI, I burned down to a 1 check on day one. It's a little clunky still because it's day one, you know, and they basically built this thing out in just a few weeks. But It's very powerful, fully on chain, no dependencies, all SVGs. And if you're a smaller holder, the UI is perfect. It's just that I have so many that I would kill for some like search functions and filtering functions. But I don't expect them to build out functionality for the like dozen people that need it. So, because like doing that burn, if I had just chucked 64 random checks into the fire, I probably could have done all the transactions and finished in about an hour. But since I wanted a red check, 2-speed, and I wanted it to be made completely out of checks that serial number starts with 1, and I wanted it on day, like it took 12 to 13 hours probably to pair test everything and really be methodical about it. But again, like I don't expect them to build out functionality for the few people who are dealing with that kind of a number. For most people, the UI is, I think, perfect. And so I've been having fun with it. I did that 1 check burn on day 1. My day 2 burn was I took 2 1 bands, which are kind of the rarest, most desirable, and I burned those together to make the only 2-color check in existence. All checks have 1 color or 5 or more colors, and there's 1 check with 2 colors, and it's that one I made yesterday. So there's some fun experiments to be found still in the system. Like there's a lot of potential here that we're still exploring. I kind of compare it to people are chess or checkers or poker, and I'm like, no, it's like a children's game like tag, where like that's lava and that's the base, and like we kind of bring our own meaning to it, and so having the only 2-color check to me, it's pretty cool, and it only cost me 2 floor checks to do it. So, well, I say 2 floor checks, 2 floor 1 bands to do it. So probably like I think 5 ether worth of floor checks. But it's little things like that. It's been a lot of fun. I've been enjoying it. Try to think of what my burn will be tomorrow.
Yeah, I was going to ask, and so that's kind of the zoomed in, check by check approach. I've heard a lot, and I've heard you speak a couple times about your plans for the black check. You mind sharing with us, kind of how that's been going over the last week?
Yeah, absolutely. We've made a lot of progress. We've got the architecture is all pretty much dialed in at this point, and a lot of the code has been written. There's a lot left to be written though, because basically now we've kind of come to a point where it's primarily security concerns, kind of engineering around the possibility for a 51% attack specifically. That's kind of the nightmare scenario here. I worried early on that somebody would have like stealthily minted 4,096 of these across a bunch of anon wallets, and that they would just scoop a black check on day 1. I think the bigger threat is that someone has sneakily minted 2,049 of these and will just 51% attack the first black check DAO that's not paying attention. And so it's become our primary concern and consideration at this point is the preclusion of a 51% attack. And that's, it's not a trivial issue with something like this, especially early on. I don't particularly like the idea of supermajorities, but ultimately that may be a part of this, is that the DAO that results will be very, very open-ended. Like I want to provide the DAO as much of a blank slate as possible, except that might be a supermajority requirement in order to dispose of the check. Transferring it or selling it might require 60, 70, 80%. Who knows? It'll be an arbitrary figure ultimately, but that'll reduce a lot of the pressure too on controlling the early mint. Because if we just do a no supermajority existential votes for the DAO, then basically we need to very carefully feed in the first, let's say, 60 to 70% of checks to make sure that nobody's able to just dump thousands in at once. Whereas if we require, say, a 75% supermajority, then we really only need to social proof the first 30 to 35% to be protected against a 51% attack. So, or 76% attack in that case. But it becomes the viability of an attack drops quickly as you go into supermajority territory, though. So it's probably the most powerful tool for preventing it, but it's a little clumsy, and I don't like the idea of 25% of the DAO dictating terms to the other 75%, even on something existential. So there's some balancing to be done there still, and I'm open to, my DMs are always open to anybody with DAO experience and background and security insights in this regard. So very much something we're dialing in still. As far as getting an actual date in front of people, I'm very hesitant to give a hard date yet for when an aggregator might be ready, because we are going to just audit it to death, and it's very hard to know how long that's going to take. But I am going to try to be as transparent about everything as we go and kind of keep everybody as up to date as possible, because first mover advantage is very real. And I don't doubt that other people are doing what I'm doing right now and just not being as vocal about it. And so it's important to me that everybody know what we're doing, know that what we're going to offer is the best, and that they shouldn't FOMO into something that comes along tomorrow when we're going to have something better soon.
Yeah. So with that, let's zoom out a little bit on that, because I'm not sure that a lot of our listeners will necessarily know exactly what we're talking about here. So what Schmrypto is proposing is a DAO called the Black Check DAO, which collectively a group of people contribute checks to a DAO that ultimately burns and works its way to the black check, which again, it requires 64 checks to get down to a single check. Then it requires 64 of those single checks to get to a black check. So we're talking about 4,096 checks to get to that point. So Schmrypto, let's back up a little bit here. The idea of the black check DAO, the idea of the black check itself, why, Schmrypto? What does this mean to you? What do you think that it can mean to the NFT space in general?
Yeah, to my mind, the black check is kind of one of the more intriguing things that I've ever seen in the space, because it has no inherent value. It's an SVG of a black check. It means nothing inherently. Unlike, say, a gold ape. Like, you see a gold ape and a regular ape, and you go, well, the one made of gold should be more valuable. And it kind of tracks. Like, a lot of PFP collections, you see the gold crown, it's a rare trait, and it's going to trade for some premium. And there's a degree of mapping to the real world that takes place. But a black check is not something that we think of as having inherent value already. And so it'll mean whatever we bring to it. I think there's kind of a simple kind of brute force approach to valuing it, of just going, well, it's worth 4,096 times the floor. But is it? It's tremendously illiquid. There's a tiny number of potential buyers. Maybe it's worth a lot less than that. It's also incredibly hard to create and requires a lot of coordinated effort. Maybe it's worth a lot more than that. And so that's kind of part of the interesting question to my mind is, what is a black check worth? We've never really seen a burn that requires a quarter of a collection's population. Does value map that way? And what direction does it map? If the black check DAO is able to pull off some big multiple of floor sale of the black check, does that reprice the floor checks at the same time? I'm kind of intrigued by a lot of that component of it. There's also 3 of them, which I think is an important distinction, that you can make 3 black checks and that they're identical. There's a sort of saddle curve of rarity that exists in the checks collection, where when you first migrate your check, you get an 80 check that is maximally rare. Like, you could mint random 80 checks until the end of the universe and never see a duplicate. Of the random patterns, the gradients, you could see visual duplicates that'll have different speeds and directions and things like that. But as you burn away from migration, you get less and less rare checks. And so, like, for instance, by the time you get to a 1 check, there's really only 480 possible 1 checks, because there's 6 possible speed and directions of animation and 80 colors. And, you can ignore the day metadata because that's infinite basically. But realistically, there's only 480 possible 1 checks. Well, there's only 3 possible black checks, and they're identical. They're effectively semi-fungible back to like the original checks were. And so you're taking all this huge pool of rarity and scarcity and annihilating it to create something semi-fungible. That, to my mind, is kind of fascinating too, because it turns this idea of scarcity on its head in this space a little bit. And the fact that there's 3 is intriguing to me, because creating the first one requires that you destroy a quarter of the collection, then a third, then half. At what point does that become impossible? I think everybody, not everybody. I think a lot of people now think that checks number 1 is possible. I think a lot of that is because, the working group and I have gone out there and made them believe that it's possible by kind of showing how it can be done. Checks 2, a lot more debatable. Like check number 2 is going to be hard. It might take years. Check number 3, like even I'm not convinced that check number 3 will ever exist. And that, to my mind, is part of the appeal to it, is that, like, if we really are building the future of finance and the future of culture here, and Ether really is going to be around for many decades, well, then the pursuit of the black check becomes this like mythic thing that's just always out of reach. And what does that mean for the clout signaling and importance of check number 1 and 2, if that's the case? Like, if we as like a community spend the rest of history chasing number 3, the people who had the foresight to snag number 1 and number 2 are going to look pretty cool. That, to my mind, the phrase I've been using for it, I think the time value of clout is greater than the time value of money. And so being involved in this process and kind of establishing myself now with this is more valuable to me than the Ether would be. And so that's why I'm so committed to the game.
That's a very interesting concept right there, because if you, like right now, if you go into the originals collection and you go and look for the single checks, right now there's 10. One of those being check number 1, which is your check. So congratulations on that. That's quite a feat. And I understand you also hold check number 69 and check number 420. So you really got the bases covered here. But if you go to this collection and we look at checks number 1, for example, we can see who is holding this. And if you look at the other people who are collecting them, some of them you may or may not recognize, but some of them you do, like checks 1337 and so forth. And so when we're talking about like the attention economy, and we're talking about the future of finance and the future of NFTs, this is a super interesting concept here that you do, like taking the verified, which was like something on Twitter that anybody that was willing to pay the $8 or $11 or whatever it costs a Twitter Blue to get Twitter Blue could get. And then taking that all the way down to this concept of like a verified collector of one of the most sought after and highly valued, digital art pieces of at least 2023. So when you think about like the quest of not just getting to a single check, but then to the black check, and what kind of opportunities or doors a black check could open, or what kind of conversations it could start, and with whom, I've seen you, Schmrypto, tweeting at Budweiser and like starting to throw these concepts out there about collaboration with big brands and such. So can you speak to this idea a little bit more for us? Like, what can a black check do?
And that's what's so fun about it to me, is that it does nothing. That it's just this inert not even JPEG, inert SVG that just sort of sits there and has whatever value we freight onto it, whatever meaning we freight onto it. I tell people, and I think they might think I'm bluffing sometimes, like, I'm almost glad I didn't mint 4,000 checks. Now, obviously, I wouldn't mind having 4,000 checks, but just minting 4,000 checks and using that to burn for the black check, that doesn't mean anything. It wouldn't matter. Nobody would really give a shit. Having 12.5% of the black check and having to, organize and marshal the other nearly 90%, that has real meaning and real signaling to it that just minting the thing wouldn't have. And so it kind of means different things to different people. For me, it's a tool to get my name out there. I was on a podcast the other day, and he said, I had you on because I thought your comments were so intelligent. I said, well, I'm on because you heard of my checks bag. Like, that's the only reason anyone's heard of me, is this checks bag. And so, like, I'm already in the early days of this, seeing the like signaling power of holding these things, because it is such a bizarre, experimental, kind of avant-garde project, that having taken a big position in it so early sends a really strong signal. And I feel like that signal kind of grows proportional to, or with, but almost disproportionately to price. Like, the signal I send by holding a bunch of these at 1 ether is less than 1/10 as strong as the signal I send by holding a bunch of these at 10 ether. And similarly for the black check, like a DAO that's willing to turn down a $500 million offer for a black check is sending a pretty powerful signal to the space. And I think so, there's a lot of questions. A lot of people go, well, so the DAO will just sell the black check, right? And I go, well, maybe. That's up to the DAO. The DAO absolutely could sell the black check if they want to. But I think that you don't necessarily need to sell it to monetize it. That just being the DAO that achieved that, and the DAO that holds this thing, is going to be such a powerful signal, and result in deal flow, like very real deal flow, both for the DAO itself as a potential participant in seed rounds and things like that, and for the people in the DAO. Because, like, if I'm launching a new PFP collection, holders of a black check DAO token are a pretty obvious hardcore degen target for that allow list. And so I would anticipate that you'll see participants in a collaborative effort to hold the black check become some of the most desirable targets for allow lists and airdrops and things like that. In addition to just the signaling, that there could be financial upside there. Somebody asked me in another space, or another podcast rather, what success would look like for the DAO. And I think one important distinction before I comment on that, the working group and we're creating an aggregator. The aggregator will then create a DAO. The DAO will be designed by its holders. I am not in the business of creating a black check DAO. I'm in the business of creating the thing that creates the black check DAO. And I think that's a meaningful distinction. And so, like, I intend to make real efforts to promote the aggregator and to give people a reason to want to put their checks into the contract that we create. But ultimately, it'll be up to the DAO and the DAO's holders to find ways to drive value for holders. And what that'll ultimately look like, what success will objectively look like, is a DAO token that's a little more valuable than a check. Maybe a lot more valuable. But if people turn their check in and end up with a DAO token that trades for half as much, that's an objective form of failure. And so, the hope is that the value derived from holding a DAO token will be sufficiently greater than the value of holding a naked check that they will trade at a premium. But it'll ultimately be up to the DAO to determine that. And that's what makes it a DAO. If I present myself as like, oh, I'm going to drive value to these things, pretty quickly, that's not a DAO, that's a security. And I'm not interested in creating a security. Like, maybe the black check DAO is securitized someday so that the holders are able to sell the check and distribute those earnings. But I have no interest in creating a security. I want to create a real DAO here. And I think that's what the black check represents, is an opportunity to create a real DAO with aligned incentives and a cool origin story, and like everything you need to create a decentralized community that's usually really hard to come by. And happy coincidence, the way this plays out short circuits a lot of the securitizing parameters. People giving money to a collaborative enterprise for the purpose of profits on the efforts of others. That's the 4 boxes to make something a security. Well, checks aren't money. This is a genuinely collaborative effort, and there is no clear promoter. Once this thing launches, I'm just another holder. I'm along for the ride with the rest of the DAO, not the DAO's president or anything like that. I hope it doesn't have a president. And so the black check, to me, represents a pretty cool opportunity to launch a DAO in a way that's meaningful and in a way that I think will catch everyone's attention, which is ultimately the only currency that matters.
Yeah, just want to say thank you for coming on, and I think your commentary has been really thoughtful, and it's been great to allow our listeners to hear kind of the more of the background behind your goals here. Beyond the promotion of the Black Check DAO, is there anything else you'd like to say to the checks community, to the Visualize Value team? Yeah, use the opportunity to show anything else you want.
Absolutely. Well, the Visualize Value team, I've just been blown away. Again, they delivered exactly what they said they were going to deliver. This market has a problem with that frequently. But I mean, I've been blown away from day one. The transparency that Jack has demonstrated, the level of skill and openness that Jaleel has demonstrated, the cleanliness and cohesiveness with the rest of Jack Butcher's brand that Traff has created with the UI, Mouse Dev's security contributions. Like, it's just been a spectacular thing to watch play out. And to checks holders, I would just say that, like, there is no future where museums don't value fidenzas and squiggles. Like, we're there. We're kind of there. Like, we are on rails to a future where you will see fidenzas and squiggles and construction tokens in the finest fine art museums. And I cannot imagine a world where they have an interest in fidenzas and squiggles but ignore checks. Because checks is the first really genuinely collaborative generative art project we've ever seen. I know people point to QQL in that case, but QQL, it's collaborative in the sense that there's a canvas there that's been created that any artist can pick up. And I think that's intriguing. I love QQL. I actually have a couple of artist friends that I want to buy QQL tokens for so that they can do the actual token art, and then I'll display them in my museums. Like, that's what QQL strikes me as. It's like a decentralized commission platform almost for generative art from people who wouldn't normally produce generative art. What Checks is a genuinely collaborative effort. I'm using checks that I minted to create new pieces, and that's day one. But in the future, people are going to be buying checks that have been burned by other people that have achieved some color palette they need or gradient they need, and the process becomes really genuinely collaborative. And the black check forces that collaboration. Like, maybe somebody can brute force 4,096 checks across a non-wallets. I'm not convinced. And so it kind of forces collaboration in a way we haven't seen in the space yet, and that's really exciting to me. So one example I used in another podcast I did yesterday for the day 2 burn, I took 2 1 bands, which are the rarest type of check, and I burned 2 1 bands together to make the only 2 color check in the entire collection. Every single check in the collection has 1 color or 5 or more colors. There's 1 check that has 2 colors. And so, should that piece end up in a museum someday, because I do believe that checks are museum bound ultimately, should that piece end up in a museum someday, sounds a little egotistical, but I feel like the placard should say Jack Butcher, Jaleel, and Schmrypto, because I took those 2 pieces and used them as a medium to burn together to create a new piece. And if that's the future here, if checks are really a chance to see your name on a placard in a museum, which I think is a realistic future, that's an interesting element here that we've never seen in NFTs. Like, to take your work and effort and attention as a degen and see that kind of projected into the fine art world, the trad art world, that's a pretty cool opportunity that I don't think we've ever really seen before. And QQL represents that opportunity as well. Like, anybody could buy a QQL, pop it, and then if that QQL ends up in a museum, I think the curatorially correct approach would be to put their name on it. But very small number of opportunities like that to project your persona as a degen into the fine art world in that way. And that's cool to me.
Yeah, and I do think that I've heard Jack speak to this idea of, they've created this as a platform for other people to be creative and express themselves and create art on. And so I think that aligns with Jack's vision from what I can tell. But that's a really interesting concept. This idea that, if this ends up in a museum, you're essentially there along with the artists and the creators as part of the, curation process and development of that check. So that's a pretty cool idea. And I do think in general, like where we're at right now with the NFT space, we're seeing with this particular project, like a lot of crossover between people who are traditionally more focused on PFP, kind of interested in checks. And I think that's because it started at such an approachable price point with the open edition, and it kind of gave an opportunity for people to pick one up as it ran up from there. And that is kind of Jack's like idea, right? And kind of big point that he's trying to make is it's about building consensus from the ground up. And you contrast that with the other big event that happened on Super Bowl, which is the Digidaigaku commercial, right? Spending millions of dollars to produce a commercial that everybody, quote, is going to see during the Super Bowl, and kind of like hoping that that's going to trickle down to collectors who activate people who are going to collect. And it's almost like two completely different sides of the spectrum here, right? It's like top down versus ground up. Personally, I see a lot more utility and a lot brighter opportunity for building consensus from the ground up. And I think what we've seen with some of the projects that have really taken off in the space, and that's what it is. When people talk about community as a utility, they're talking about, really like networking and building from the ground up and having kind of like that kind of relationship and that kind of network. And I think that in this space, community in general, it's used as a buzzword, and I really encourage people who listen to this to like think to the next level of what an NFT community can do, what it can mean. Just look at this podcast for an example here. All three of us that are sitting here discussing this, we have these common points. In this case, it's Jack Butcher's checks, but we're creating content together, we're ideating together, and potentially opens the door for other business opportunities and for these relationships to grow. So I really encourage people to like dig into that, like hook into that opportunity to network in the NFT space that truly is one of the best utilities, but you have to activate it. You have to reach out one extra step and make those connections. And so, hopefully that resonates with some people here. Appreciate your time, Schmrypto. This is a super engaging phenomenon that's happening here. We're going to continue to be watching closely and participating, and learning more about visualized value, the checks. And also, I think you mentioned at some point that in terms of the DAO, that you were collaborating with the artists that we talked about, Lucrece, in terms of the DAO. Can you give us any kind of input as to like what you're thinking about there?
Yeah, it's so funny. Des laughs about my determination to tie the two projects together every way I can. So when I realized there's 8 non-black check denominations, and there's 8 colors of Lucrece's Defy, and so our DAO tokens were designed by Lucrece. If you go back through my timeline, you can find it. There's it was my PFP up until I switched to my one check, but red background, raspberry background, black check, and it's done in his 3-frame boiling animation. And so when you turn in your checks to the DAO, what you get back will be a token that on the face of it is a token by Lucrece, but when you click it, you can flip it over and you'll see the check you contributed as well. So your check won't really die when you send it to the DAO. You'll still be able to display your check art. It'll just be on the reverse of your DAO token. And so I'm looking forward to that. And then it creates a fun little dynamic too, where like in the checks, we have what's called the semi-perfect set, one of everything, basically. Well, the only way to get the full Dow token set is to turn in a semi-perfect set, and then you get all 8 colors of Dow token. And maybe we do some fun little airdrop or something for set holders there eventually too, because that'll be even at current prices, that's 128 ether contribution, so we need to do something special for them. But that was exciting to me. And it was so funny. I was on a call with Des, and I said, "Man, it sure would be cool if I could talk you into doing some tokens for this DAO." And he doesn't do commissions like ever. And 10 minutes later, he said, "Hey, check this out." And I was stunned. 10 minutes later, he had made that thing, and it looked spectacular. So I was really happy about that. And so that'll be what we distribute. That'll be what the aggregator actually dispenses, will be those DAO tokens. Blue will be the lowest, raspberry will be the highest. So if you turn in a Checks edition, you'll get a blue DAO token, for instance.
Awesome. I love to hear that. So the one last thing before we let you go here, when in speaking to like the average, NFT collector that has an interest in learning more about art and learning more about these checks, I mean, do you have any like general advice, Schmrypto?
I think you can't go wrong by just studying art blocks if you want to get your head around what generative collections can do and kind of how they trade and all that. You've just got a great record there in art blocks, and it's just a great collection to be familiar with in general. I think as far as learning more about checks, you just can't go wrong with following Jack. He's still updating Transparency Time thread, and is as transparent a builder as I've ever seen in the space. He's got another OE that dropped around the same time as checks called Opepin that hasn't really had anything happen with it yet too. So for people who feel like they missed the checks boat, he has said that, it's funny, he hasn't said he will do something with Opepin. He has said he won't do something with Opepin until he has something good and is completely done with the checks deployment. Well, checks deployment is done. So, it may be that there's something fun coming for Opepin for people who feel like they missed out on checks. And he's building an ecosystem, frankly. Like checks is part of a larger ecosystem. There's actually 3 OEs. There's checks, Opepin, and merge. I would recommend people not get too ahead of themselves with merge. He said he'll do something with it in about 9 years. So, hold your horses. But he's also got a huge foundation collection that I think now they're trading at like 3 to 5 ether a piece, which if you consider what the floor for checks is and the size of the collection there, if you're into one of ones, Jack's one of ones are probably a pretty good deal still. And otherwise, just the visualized value Discord, like any visualized value stuff, that's Jack's overarching brand, is visualized value. So anytime you see VV, that's what that's referring to. He does courses basically that you can buy on business communication and online communication and things like that. And it's funny, he does full refunds on written material. And so you could do the course and then just demand a refund and you'll get it. Nobody does though, because it's good material. And I think his first course is like $1. I have viewed the material. I haven't officially done any of the courses. Everything I've seen has been really good, and I end up interacting with a lot of visualized value people through checks, and they're a sharp bunch. Like, they have kind of a common ethos too that I think originates in that material that has served them pretty well. So that's another kind of tangent to all this that's worth looking into for anybody that's really down the rabbit hole.
Mitch, do you have any kind of like departing words for Schmrypto here?
I guess the story of the wanting to have one more than the 230, the friend with 236 makes sense. I wish I had some good friends like that. I minted, but kind of in a bit of a just liked what Jack was doing and supported. Just really excited to see it happen. You doubled down on your high conviction, literally getting up above 500, and just best of luck in your pursuit. We'll watch. I'm also sure that like everybody, and Goodmonth included, on the team is down to throw a check or two into the cause and be able to participate. It's been hard to, I think people have struggled to really figure out the right way to create these big DAOs, and maybe this is finally here that will unlock that like super DAO that we've been looking for. So yeah, just again, thanks for your efforts and coming on, and look forward to watching you more in the space.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. I always enjoy these talks. I could talk about checks just all day, every day. It's a little bit of an obsession at this point. So
that's awesome. Love to hear it. That was great input. That concludes episode 13 of the Never Fade podcast. You heard that, Alpha. Pepin may be something to look into. I did see a little nod to Vincent Van Doe, a big collector in the space. If you haven't seen his wallet, you should check that out. It's filled with all kinds of bangers. So Schmrypto, again, thank you so much for your time. Mitch, great to have you back on the show. Hazy B, take us out with that Garden Jack track produced by Goodmonth ETH. Let's go.
You ain't gonna catch me without a roof over my head, verifying everything. That's a bad bet if the bags check less. About to burn back to back, flipping not cheap when that Jenny duh hits. That's the race to 250 in the world, and you chose to sleep. That's a bad bet if you wake up checkless. No more people without bags, yet they need status. Running head first with the VVChecks. Never heard of a hearse, but they connecting the dots.